So welcome. First of all, if you want a copy of the slides, I've taken a short link. I really hope that I typed it properly. So if any of you are crazy enough to want to view my presentation again or look at the slides and references, you can always use that short link below. So today I'm going to talk to you for a very brief history of information, starting really with medieval monks. It's a very Eurocentric history. So at the start, most information was so difficult, so expensive to distribute. It was mostly done by monks. There were people who were writing it by hand. They were writing it in very expensive books. And this meant that it was very difficult to access any sort of information whatsoever. Bam! We have the printing press. We've got Gutenberg. And we've got all sorts of cool stuff. Suddenly information becomes much cheaper. And capitalism means that if somebody wants something printed, they will have it printed. So suddenly you get information that's reproduced at such a fast rate that information that challenges governments, information that challenges established interests, can spread very quickly. So we already have this trend that the cheaper it is to reproduce information, the easier it is for information that doesn't always fit government agendas to spread. And then we have YouTube comments. That's actually really relevant, because previously we saw that the cost of putting forward information has gone down. First, it was super expensive for monks to do it. It was cheaper to do it in an era of print. And with YouTube comments, it's become super cheap. As in, the cost, the effort required is very low. But previously, effort was a bit of a natural barrier. So if you had to find the capital to find something printed, if you had to go for the effort of preparing for something to print, even if you wanted to write a letter to the editor, in general, you had to have some sort of good point. You had to have something deliberative, something smart to say. Otherwise, you wouldn't really go for the effort. And as all of us who have seen YouTube comments and despaired, and you haven't seen YouTube comments, don't, as all of us who have seen YouTube comments and despaired seen, this isn't a particularly good form of communication. Because essentially, the moment the cost of the communication is so low that everybody can contribute without any natural friction, then suddenly the communication isn't that effective because it doesn't effectively filter out those who have smart stuff to say from those who don't have particularly smart stuff to say. So all of this, you could call it, via loose term, called gatekeeping. Essentially, who controls your access to information? Once, it was monks. Then, it was market mechanisms. And now, it seems like we don't have any gatekeeping, given YouTube comments, because anybody can write anything unrestricted. Except it completely isn't. That's a bit of an oversimplification, really. So, if we, for example, look at Facebook feeds and others, there are powerful algorithms that are controlling our access to information. There are powerful algorithms that are telling us what we should watch, when we should watch it, etc. This is actually a really interesting article, because it tells us about the sort of tens and hundreds of different factors that Facebook uses to determine what it is we see. It feels like our timeline is very organic, but actually it's something that's been very much selected by a group of algorithms. How many times have I liked posts by the other person? Is this content video or images? In all of those cases, Facebook has become a natural gatekeeper, just like print, just like publishers once were. Facebook has become this gatekeeper, but whereas once with publishing, for example, letters, or publishing printed books, this process seemed at least semi-transparent, as in the editor of the New York Times makes a decision. With Facebook, there's no transparency whatsoever. Now I'm going to challenge you with a scary chart, and play with a laser pointer. So, as you can tell, the higher sort of the power of the gatekeeper, the higher usually the cost of publishing. So essentially, the cheaper it is to publish, so YouTube and Facebook comments, the easier it is, the harder it is to keep control of them, but the less deliberative, the less democratic it really is. Like, we could argue that this is sort of the democratic sweet spot right here, whereas people write something, even though the cost of writing something is reasonably hard, because they have something to share that's really important. And I was doing some research about Egypt during the Arab Spring, and you could see the same thing. Previously, when people were writing long posts, those posts were super smart. When people needed to fight for an audience, they wrote super smart things. But the moment the revolution happened, people just started sharing posts that weren't particularly clever. People were sharing posts that were, in short, very cheap to publish, and cheap publishing is not particularly good for democracy. But this is an open data conference, so let's talk about open data. There are three kinds of lies. Lies, damn lies, and statistics. I have no idea who said that. It's commonly attributed to Mark Twain. But it's a really, really interesting quote, I think, because statistics aren't meant to lie. Statistics aren't meant to be biased. Statistics are meant to be nice and objective. And what I feel people actually object to is not the fact that we have statistics. These numbers don't usually lie to you. Rather, what people have trouble with is that just as we have with monks, just as we have with publishers, and just as we have with Facebook algorithms, there's always some sort of gatekeeper that goes through our statistics. So I was, for example, trying to look at non-gatekept statistics. This is data from the spending of the Foreign Office. As you can tell, it's really complicated. Like, it's this type of data that this is the British or Foreign Office's spending around above £25,000. They always have to publish complicated charts. As you can tell, this isn't something that will instantly lead to accessibility, because in each one of those cases, you need to have some sort of gatekeeper. Like, this is the YouTube comment equivalent of data. This is the type of data where it's so cheap to publish and so cheap to get that there's nobody standing between you and the data. But the problem is that the moment somebody stands between you and the data, that somebody jumps into a position of power. The moment somebody has the power to interpret data, they have the power to sort of shape the way we see that data. This is a super, super fun example. This is labor and unemployment statistics. And even the power to define a statistic is really, really, really big. We usually just look at unemployment data. How many people are out of work? And we have a very, very specific unemployment definition, which I'm not going to bore you with, because quite frankly, I don't know it. But there is a couple of other definitions. There's underemployment. There's people who have the potential to be employed but cannot enter the labor force at the moment. And this is sort of a chart with, this is the actual unemployment rate. And this is, for example, the underemployment rate. And this is that's the potential additional labor force. And that's the underemployment rate. So a mere definition of unemployment and a mere political choice to define unemployment in one way or another already completely frames the way we look at such data. So data always has certain gatekeepers. Otherwise it looks like this. And this isn't particularly useful. We don't have any definition. We don't have anything that can guide us. If we have this, we've already sat down with somebody and gotten somebody, in this case a government, to take a political decision on behalf of us in order to classify our data in one way or another. That's why we have lies, damn lies, and statistics. Because statistics are always mediated by somebody else who makes a political decision and interprets it on behalf of us. So in short, anytime we deal with open data, we always have those types of gatekeepers. Those are governments, those that control the release of the data, the ones that define what constitutes a crime, what constitutes unemployment. None of this data is raw. All of this data goes through a certain definition, and that's in itself a political decision. We have journalists. Journalists interpret the data. They are the publishers. They are the ones who essentially turn this data into nice graphs and try to turn some conclusions out of them. And finally, we have statisticians who play a very similar role as well. All of those are very, very much needed in the data ecosystem. Otherwise, our data ecosystem becomes very, very messy, and otherwise we essentially get the YouTube comment equivalent of data. The problem is that we very often think that data is just an automatic path to democracy, and we choose not to interrogate those who are in power, and we choose never to question the power structures that underlie our open data. So we can't just think about the quantity of open data, we also have to think about the quality thereof. And to what extent it's been mediated by power structures, and what interests the government, journalists, and statisticians have. They might very much align with our interests, but what interests they have when talking about open data. That doesn't mean that those interests have to be bad. That doesn't mean that they have to be nefarious. Very often governments release data for the purposes of better governance. But they are still power structures and they still need to be questioned. And the really, really scary thing is, that I have 20 seconds left, but the other really, really scary thing is that the bigger the data becomes, the more processing power it requires, and the less accessible it is to everybody else. Donald Trump's campaign, Barack Obama's campaign, all of them use massive, massive data sets. That's another really cool article that I encourage all of you to look up. But the problem is that those data sets were not available to smaller groups because none of them had the sufficient budget to essentially buy their own servers and analyze massive parts of open data. So even if the data were available, the mere processing power and technical abilities required to draw political conclusions out of this data reinforced rather than challenged existing political structures precisely because it was so difficult to process the data. The bigger the data gets, the more expensive it gets, and the more it entrenches rather than challenges our existing power structures. And this is super important. So in short, if you're not managing your information, and you're probably not managing your information because otherwise you just get a stream of raw data separated by commas and YouTube comments, then somebody else is. I'm not saying that that's a good thing. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that that's something that we really need to be aware of, because there's very often the assumption that open data is something very pure and unmoderated. Thank you.